What is the government's role here? What should the government be doing? Should the government be doing anything to help these airlines given the cost of fuel right now?
Well, it's certainly true that the cost of fuel is a major input for airlines, and it's something that is perceived as, I believe, in reality, going to be temporary. And once we have a sustainable resolution to the conflict, you should see prices come down across the board. And so if this is sort of the limiting factor right now, and one which will be short term, then perhaps there's an argument to be made that you don't want enterprises to collapse systematically based upon what is a temporary condition. So if that's the situation, it's a very different one than if you have an enterprise that just has a totally unsustainable balance sheet or isn't viable.
You've had a number of these ultra-low-cost airlines going to the White House, going to the Transportation Department, saying their situation is a bit precarious here. You have had a front-row seat to the effect that the pressures on low-cost airlines have had. So Spirit flew out of Sacramento, I think, until October of last year. They ended those routes out of Sacramento International Airport. How acute is that pressure? How worried are you about having that low end of the spectrum there when it comes to carriers?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people rely upon these flights, folks who are on a budget and need to go visit their relatives or need to travel for whatever business or personal reasons. And so if you have that, that part of the market that is going to be much more limited or, is not going to be an option for a lot of people, that is a big issue. Actually, you're right. We did have a Spirit flight out of Sacramento, which I've taken. So I think that, it is very concerning if you start to see more of some sort of domino effect here.
I think it all just goes into affordability, and we're going to talk about some of this polling later in the show, but Americans more and more are just feeling like they're really getting the squeeze kind of everywhere. And I'm wondering, going into November, what you're hearing from your constituents about the cost of living and who they think is responsible for those prices going up.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely the #1 issue for folks that I represent and folks throughout California. And I should mention that California has the highest cost of living in the country. We were just talking about fuel prices. California's fuel prices are about $1.80 the national average. They're a full 40-some cents higher than the next closest state, which is Hawaii. And it's not just fuel prices. Electricity rates in California are higher than anywhere in the country. Housing costs and water bills close to the top. Groceries, second or third highest in the country. So it's an acute problem for my constituents. Now, as to your second question, who's to blame? I think that question is not always, constructive when it comes to actually trying to address the problem. If I really had to answer, I'd say there's plenty of blame to go around. In Sacramento, we've had a number of policies that have increased the cost of living across all of these dimensions. And there are in Washington, D.C., in recent years that have done that as well. So I'm, the one independent member of the House of Representatives. I've said that gives me a unique ability to hold folks accountable both in Washington and in Sacramento, as well as to work with people on all sides of the issue. So I've proposed a number of measures to lower the cost of living through some of the regulations that have gone way too far for California that have made our state the most expensive state in the country. But it is certainly a nationwide issue that people are feeling everywhere, and I think there's a lot more we could do in Congress as well.
We've been asking our guests about that when it comes to fuel prices, in particular, what more the government can do. I looked up AAA's website before we talked to you this morning. I saw that gas where you live, $6 and change per gallon for regular gas, so extremely expensive. I know we've heard some speculation that maybe Congress would consider removing the tax on gasoline. What are the policy prescriptions you're looking to as a member of Congress to reduce some of that burden on Americans who are grappling with these high costs?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So in California, I'd say first, it would be good to limit the gas tax or even suspend it right now. We're talking about 61 cents a gallon, higher than anywhere else in the country. There's also a number of regulations around the fuel blend that are unique in California that have caused our refineries to start shutting down. I mean, California is actually importing most of its gasoline, including from the Bahamas, which is really bad for the environment too, because the fuel comes over on these these tankers that are not good for the environment. So those are two California-specific things. I think that nationwide, you actually had seen gas prices come down in response to an increase of supply, in response to measures that have been taken to increase America's capacity to produce our own energy. And I think that that is, the long-term driver of lower prices. Obviously, we've seen this sharp increase over the last couple months owing to the conflict and the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And so, in order to get prices back down, we do need to see a quick, expeditious end to this conflict that is consistent with our objectives there.
Do you think the administration is doing enough to try to do just that? Is there enough pressure from the White House? Is there enough desire from the White House, do you feel like, to get this resolved in a quick way to get that strait open again?
I think there is, because the consequences, are obviously not good for a lot of people in our country and around the world. And it would be, I think, obviously the desire of pretty much everyone in the administration that we would find an acceptable resolution. But, I think also we have to consider what the objectives were there, not only from the beginning of this conflict, but what has been longstanding U.S. policy across different administrations.
But what are the objectives of this conflict at this point? What are the objectives? Is it to denuclearize? Is it all of these other things as well? It seems like it's been a little bit unclear from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly a valid point, that there has been probably less clarity on a number of issues surrounding this conflict than some of us in Congress would like. But the overriding objective, which I would hold to, and which has been there for not just this conflict, but every administration in U.S. history, is that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And it's not just some sort of slogan or talking point. We have to consider what that would mean for the region, for the world, for U.S. interests, if one of the most evil regimes in history got its hands on the most powerful weapon in history. And so I think that rightly that objective, whatever else we might be looking at in terms of their conventional abilities, in terms of everything else, that needs to be front and center.
If you wouldn't mind, tee up our next conversation. Your colleague from the House, Cleo Fields, Democrat of Louisiana, is going to join us, and his district is the center of the Supreme Court decision that we got this week, which kind of hollowed out Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. You have been very outspoken about the way that gerrymandering is being used as a political weapon by both parties here going into the midterm elections and beyond. You mentioned you're an independent now. You were a Republican. California, of course, is being carved up, and its congressional districts are changing as a result. What is your major takeaway from the decision that was handed down at the court last week?
Well, I think it has the potential to simply set this gerrymandering war, which has been terrible for the country, into yet another cycle and spin it out of control even further. So that's why I think there's an even greater imperative now for congressional action to get this issue gerrymandering under control. I think that this whole redistricting war has been complete folly. Frankly, neither side has really won in any meaningful sense. It's upended representation in state after state after state. I think it's eroded trust in our politics. It's going to increase polarization and increase distrust even more. So I've been against it in Texas, in California, in Virginia, in Florida, anywhere that it's happened. And to the extent that now other states are seeing a further opportunity to do this, it's going to make things even worse. So I think it's about time that Congress took responsibility for its own elections. We're talking about elections to Congress here. So I think there's two to do. Number one is to prohibit mid-decade redistricting like we're seeing now. I've introduced a bill to do that. And then by the time we actually have the next census, when we're supposed to do regular redistricting, we should come up with a legislative solution to end gerrymandering in this country for good and guarantee all Americans fair district lines.